The winter sky over the Ardennes region hung heavy with clouds on December 23, 1944. Below, the frozen forests of Belgium stretched endlessly, their snow-laden branches concealing one of the most desperate gambles of World War II. The Battle of the Bulge had transformed this peaceful landscape into a crucible of fire and steel, where Germany's last major offensive in the West was reaching its critical phase. But high above these frozen battlefields, another drama was about to unfold, one that would be nearly forgotten by history, yet would fundamentally alter the balance of air power in the European theater. If you're fascinated by untold stories from World War II and want to discover more incredible accounts of courage and combat, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring these forgotten moments of history back to life. Captain James Hartwell adjusted his oxygen mask as he led his flight of 5 P-47 Thunderbolts through the gray December sky. The 32-year-old pilot from Iowa had flown 73 combat missions over Europe, but something about this patrol felt different. Intelligence reports had been fragmentary at best. Ground fog had grounded most aircraft for days, giving the German offensive crucial momentum. Now, with a brief break in the weather, every available fighter was scrambling to provide air support for the beleaguered American ground forces. Hartwell's journey to this moment had been long and winding. Growing up on a farm outside Des Moines during the Depression, he'd watched crop dusters work the fields and dreamed of flying. His father, a World War I veteran who'd served in the trenches of France, had been skeptical at first. Flying seemed like a rich man's hobby, not a practical career for a farmer's son, but young James had been persistent. He'd worked odd jobs, saved every penny, and paid for flying lessons at a small airfield 20 miles from home. By the time war broke out in Europe, he had over 200 hours of flight time and a commercial pilot's license. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Hartwell had enlisted immediately. His flying experience fast-tracked him through flight training, and by early 1943 he was in England, assigned to the 56th Fighter Group. His first combat mission had been terrifying. A bomber escort to Germany where he'd seen B-17s falling from the sky, trailing fire and debris. But he'd learned quickly, absorbing lessons from veteran pilots and developing an almost intuitive sense for air combat tactics. What set him apart wasn't just his flying skill, but his ability to think tactically, to see the bigger picture of an engagement while simultaneously managing the immediate threats. Hartwell's wingman, Lieutenant Robert Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, flew tight formation off his right wing. Despite facing discrimination and skepticism back home, Chen had proven himself to be one of the squadron's most capable pilots. His sharp eyes and lightning reflexes had saved Hartwell's life twice in previous engagements. Chen's path to the cockpit had been even more challenging than Hartwell's. Growing up in San Francisco's Chinatown, he'd faced the dual burden of poverty and prejudice. His parents ran a small restaurant, working 18-hour days to support their family. Robert had been an exceptional student, winning a scholarship to study engineering at the University of California. When war came, many questioned whether Chinese Americans could be trusted with military service. Some suggested they might sympathize with Japan, despite the bitter history between China and Japan. Chen had to fight every step of the way to prove his loyalty and capability. He'd applied to the Army Air Corps 3 times before being accepted, each rejection accompanied by vague explanations about security concerns. Alas, finally, after Pearl Harbor, when the need for pilots became desperate, his application was approved. Even then, he faced instructors who doubted his abilities and fellow trainees who viewed him with suspicion. But Chen had something to prove, not just for himself, but for every Asian American who would come after him. He excelled in every phase of training, finishing at the top of his class in gunnery and formation flying. In combat, he'd proven that courage and skill knew no ethnic boundaries. Hartwell trusted him absolutely, and that trust was mutual. On the left flew Lieutenant Michael O'Brien, a former crop duster from Texas whose instinctive understanding of low-altitude flying made him invaluable for ground attack missions. O'Brien had grown up flying. His father owned a small crop dusting business, and Michael had been in the cockpit since he was 12 years old, first as an observer, then gradually taking the controls under his father's supervision. By 16, he was flying solo, skimming over cotton fields with a precision that left older, more experienced pilots shaking their heads in amazement. When the war started, O'Brien had been 24, already with thousands of hours of low-level flying experience. The Army Air Corps had recognized immediately that his skills were ideal for ground attack work, but they'd also insisted he learn proper fighter tactics and formation flying. The transition hadn't been easy. Crop dusting was solitary work, while fighter combat demanded constant awareness of other aircraft and coordination with wingmen. But O'Brien had adapted, bringing his exceptional stick and rudder skills to bear in combat. He had an almost supernatural ability to make his Thunderbolt do things that shouldn't have been possible with such a large, heavy aircraft. Flying tail end, Charlie were 2 of the squadron's newest pilots. Second Lieutenant David Murphy, fresh-faced and eager at 20 years old, and Flight Officer Antonio Ramirez, a quiet but determined pilot from New Mexico who'd overcome significant obstacles to earn his wings. Murphy represented the new generation of American fighter pilots, young men who'd grown up hearing about the exploits of World War I aces and who'd rushed to join up after Pearl Harbor. He'd enlisted on his 18th birthday, literally walking into the recruitment office the morning he became eligible. His father, a factory worker in Detroit, had tried to convince him to wait, to think it through, but David had been adamant. He wanted to fly, to serve, to be part of something bigger than himself. His training had been excellent but compressed. The Army Air Corps was churning out pilots as fast as possible to replace losses and expand the force. Murphy had less than 200 total flying hours when he arrived in Europe, and only 7 combat missions under his belt. But he was a quick learner, and more importantly, he listened to the experienced pilots like Hartwell, Chen, and O'Brien. He studied their tactics, absorbed their advice, and most importantly, he kept his ego in check. Young pilots who thought they knew everything tended to die quickly. Murphy understood that survival meant continuous learning. Ramirez's story was perhaps the most remarkable of all. Growing up in a small village in northern New Mexico, he'd been one of 7 children in a family that barely scraped by. His father worked as a ranch hand, his mother took in laundry, and the children all contributed what they could to the family income. Antonio had never even seen an airplane up close until he was 16, when a small air circus came through a nearby town. Watching those biplanes perform acrobatics, he'd been transfixed. Something about the freedom of flight, the mastery of 3-dimensional space, spoke to something deep inside him. He'd taught himself to read technical manuals, studying aerodynamics and aircraft mechanics with an intensity that puzzled his family. When he'd announced his intention to become a pilot, his father had been supportive but realistic. "Mijo," he'd said, "they don't let people like us fly airplanes." But Ramirez had refused to accept that limitation. He'd worked multiple jobs, saved money, and eventually scraped together enough for basic flight instruction at a tiny airfield near Albuquerque. The old barnstormer who ran the place had been skeptical at first, but Ramirez's dedication and natural talent won him over. When war came, Ramirez enlisted, despite knowing he'd face prejudice. Some military units had quotas limiting how many Hispanic soldiers they'd accept. Some training officers assumed that anyone with a Spanish surname must be poorly educated or unsuitable for technical positions. Ramirez had faced these assumptions with quiet determination, letting his performance speak for itself. He'd graduated from flight school, not at the top of his class, but solidly in the middle, good enough to be selected for fighters rather than transports or bombers. And in combat, he'd proven that courage and skill were colorblind. The radio crackled with static and fragmented transmissions. Ground stations reported German armor movements, but the true situation remained unclear through the interference and chaos of battle. Hartwell checked his instruments and scanned the sky with the methodical discipline that had kept him alive for so long. The Thunderbolt beneath him was a formidable machine, over 7 tons of radial engine, armor plate, and 8 50-caliber machine guns. It wasn't as nimble as the German fighters, but it could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower. What Hartwell didn't know was that German High Command had deployed Jagdgeschwader 26, one of their most elite fighter units, specifically to counter Allied air superiority over the Ardennes. Led by Major Klaus Brenner, a veteran ace with 47 confirmed kills, the unit had been held in reserve and equipped with the latest Focke-Wulf 190 D9 fighters. These aircraft, nicknamed Dora by their pilots, represented the pinnacle of German piston-engine fighter development. Fast, well-armed, and flown by some of Germany's most experienced surviving pilots, they were Germany's answer to Allied numerical superiority, quality over quantity. Brenner himself had been flying combat missions since the invasion of France in 1940. He'd survived the Battle of Britain, the brutal air war over Russia, and the increasingly desperate defense of the Reich. His face bore the marks of frostbite from a forced landing in Russia, and his left hand had been badly burned when his aircraft caught fire over the Channel in 1942. But his eyes remained sharp, his hands steady, and his tactical mind as dangerous as ever. The weight of Germany's declining fortunes pressed heavily on Brenner's shoulders. He'd watched too many friends die, too many skilled pilots lost to overwhelming Allied numbers. He'd seen the Luftwaffe transform from the dominant force that had conquered Poland and France into a depleted shadow, fighting a losing battle against endless waves of American and British aircraft. Every mission now felt like a desperate gamble, a last chance to make a difference before the inevitable defeat. But Brenner was a professional soldier. He'd sworn an oath, and he would honor it until the end. He'd trained his remaining pilots with the intensity of a man who knew their lives depended on his teaching. He'd shared every hard-won lesson from 5 years of combat. How to use the sun for concealment, how to maintain situational awareness in the chaos of a dogfight, how to conserve ammunition and make every burst count. His pilots respected him not just for his skill, but for his genuine concern for their survival. Today, he led 8 of his best pilots on a mission to intercept and destroy American fighter bombers before they could devastate the German armored columns pushing toward the Meuse River. The Battle of the Bulge represented Germany's last desperate gamble in the West. If it succeeded, it might buy time for negotiated peace. If it failed, the war was effectively over. The Luftwaffe's role was crucial: deny the Allies air superiority, even temporarily, and give the ground forces a fighting chance. It was a heavy burden, but Brenner had carried heavy burdens before. The two formations were on a collision course, though neither yet knew it. Hartwell's flight had descended to 8,000 feet, searching for breaks in the cloud cover that would allow them to spot German positions. The air was bitterly cold, even inside their heated cockpits. Ice crystals formed on the windscreens, requiring constant use of defrosting equipment. Visibility remained poor, with layers of clouds creating a landscape of gray cotton that could hide threats until they were dangerously close. Chen's voice came through the radio, calm but alert. "Lead, this is 2. I've got movement at our 10 o'clock high, coming out of that cloud bank." Hartwell snapped his head left and up, searching the indicated position. For a moment he saw nothing but clouds and pale winter sky. Then they emerged, dark shapes diving from above, their profiles unmistakable even at distance. Focke-Wulf 190. D9s, and they were coming fast. "Brake left! Brake left!" Hartwell shouted into his radio, simultaneously slamming his throttle forward and hauling the Thunderbolt into a violent turn. The massive aircraft responded, its Pratt and Whitney engine roaring as it transformed potential energy into kinetic fury. His vision narrowed at the edges as G-forces pressed him into his seat. Brenner had achieved perfect surprise, or so he thought. His formation dropped from 15,000 feet with the sun behind them, hidden by clouds until the last moment. His plan was textbook: separate the American formation, isolate individual aircraft, and use superior speed and altitude to dictate the terms of engagement. Against most Allied pilots, it would have worked perfectly. But Hartwell wasn't most pilots. Instead of the expected defensive break that would scatter his formation, Hartwell executed something called a defensive wheel, a maneuver where all aircraft turned in the same direction, maintaining formation while presenting a continuously moving, mutually supporting circle of firepower. It was difficult to execute, required precise coordination, and most importantly, it kept the formation together. Chen, O'Brien, Murphy, and Ramirez responded instantly, their Thunderbolts following Hartwell into the turn. The wheel formed, and as the German fighters committed to their attack, they found themselves not facing isolated targets, but a coordinated defensive formation where each aircraft protected the others. Brenner's first burst of cannon fire passed behind Hartwell's tail, as the American pilots turned tightened beyond what the German ace had anticipated. The distinctive ripping sound of 20mm cannon fire echoed through the cockpit, but no rounds struck home. Brenner cursed and pulled up, his Focke-Wulf's superior power-to-weight ratio allowing him to climb away from the engagement. His wingman, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a veteran with 31 kills, rolled in on Chen's Thunderbolt. Weber had been flying since Spain, where he'd cut his teeth in the Condor Legion. His hands moved with the unconscious precision of thousands of hours of combat flying. But Chen had seen him coming. The American pilot chopped his throttle and deployed his flaps in a radical speed reduction maneuver that caused Weber's Focke-Wulf to overshoot. In that brief moment, Chen's aircraft was vulnerable, slowed, and unable to maneuver effectively, but O'Brien was there. The Texas pilot had maintained his position in the wheel, and as Weber flashed past Chen, O'Brien had a perfect deflection shot. His .850 caliber machine guns roared to life, the tracers walking across the sky toward the German fighter. Weber saw them coming and tried to break away, but he'd committed too hard to the attack. .50 caliber rounds stitched across the Focke-Wulf's left wing, tearing through metal and severing control cables. The German fighter rolled violently and went into an uncontrolled dive. Weber fought the controls, trying to level out, but the damage was too severe. At 3,000 feet, he jettisoned his canopy and pulled the manual release for his parachute. The white canopy blossomed above him as he drifted down toward the frozen forest below, his aircraft impacting with a distant explosion. The radio erupted with calls and countercalls as the engagement intensified. 3 more German fighters rolled in on the American formation, trying to break the defensive wheel through sheer aggression. Oberleutnant Hans Müller, 26 kills and an Iron Cross First Class, positioned himself for a head-on pass against Murphy's aircraft. It was a high-risk maneuver, but Müller was confident in his aircraft's heavy nose-mounted armament. The young American pilot and the veteran German ace hurtled toward each other at a combined speed of over 700 miles per hour. Murphy's hands trembled on the controls. This was only his 8th combat mission, and nothing in training had prepared him for the reality of watching another aircraft grow from a speck to filling his windscreen in seconds, both aircraft firing continuously. The noise was overwhelming. His own guns hammering, the engine roaring, the slipstream screaming past the canopy. Tracer rounds from Muller's guns flashed past his cockpit, some striking his right wing. The young pilot's mind raced through everything he'd been taught. Don't freeze, don't panic. Trust your training, keep firing. Hold your course until the last possible moment. His instructors had taught him about closure rates, about deflection shooting, about aircraft recognition, but they couldn't teach him about the sheer terror of seeing another pilot's face through a windscreen, knowing that one of them might be dead in the next second. Murphy's mouth was dry, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it over the engine noise, but his hands remained steady on the controls, his finger depressing the trigger, sending 8 streams of 50 caliber rounds toward the oncoming German fighter. At the last possible instant, both pilots broke away. Muller's Focke-Wulf rolled right and dove. Murphy's Thunderbolt went left and up. For a moment, Murphy thought he'd missed. Then he saw the smoke trail. His burst had struck Muller's engine cowling, and coolant was streaming from the damaged power plant. The German ace would have to break off and try to make it back to German-controlled territory before his engine seized. Murphy's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline hitting him in a delayed wave. He'd just survived a head-on pass with a veteran German pilot. He was still alive. His aircraft was still flying. The realization was almost overwhelming. Over the radio, he heard Hartwell's voice, calm and steady, calling for position reports. That voice, that professionalism, helped center Murphy. This wasn't over. Stay focused, stay alert. Ramirez, flying the tail-end position, suddenly found himself facing 2 German fighters simultaneously. Lieutenant Josef Kramer and Feldwebel Ernst Schmidt had coordinated their attack, coming from different angles to create an impossible defensive situation. Ramirez's heart hammered in his chest. Growing up in rural New Mexico, he'd faced discrimination and doubt at every step of his journey to the cockpit. Now over Belgium, he faced something far more immediate, survival. The tactical situation was desperate. Schmidt was diving from above and behind, while Kramer approached from the side, scissors maneuver setting up for a deflection shot. Standard defensive tactics wouldn't work. Turning away from one attacker would expose him fatally to the other. Ramirez had perhaps 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. In that moment, everything his instructors had taught him crystallized into clarity. The Thunderbolt's strengths were its ruggedness, its powerful engine, and its ability to absorb punishment. Its weakness was maneuverability. He couldn't outturn the German fighters. So don't try. Use what you have. Instead of trying to evade both attackers, Ramirez did something unexpected. He reversed his turn, heading directly toward Kramer's fighter while presenting his armored belly to Schmidt's attack from below. It was a calculated risk, based on knowing that the Thunderbolt's radial engine and armor plate could absorb significant punishment from the front. The massive Pratt and Whitney radial engine sat in front of him like a shield, 18 cylinders of aluminum and steel that could stop rounds that would kill him if they reached the cockpit. Kramer, surprised by the aggressive move, pulled up to avoid collision. His burst went high, tracers arcing over Ramirez's canopy. Schmidt's rounds hammered into the Thunderbolt's underside, but the armor did its job. Fragments of metal tore away, hydraulic fluid sprayed in pink mist, but the massive radial engine kept running. Ramirez felt the impacts through his seat, felt the aircraft shudder, heard the bang of rounds striking metal. But he kept flying, kept his focus on Kramer's aircraft. As Kramer pulled up and crossed above him, Ramirez snap-rolled inverted and fired a long burst at the exposed belly of the German fighter. The deflection was perfect, the timing exact. His years of studying aerial combat, of watching gun camera footage, of listening to veterans describe their kills, it all came together in that moment. The result was catastrophic. Ramirez's rounds found the Focke-Wulf's fuel tank. The aircraft erupted in orange flame, pieces of wing and fuselage tumbling through the sky. Kramer had no chance to bail out. The fireball fell toward the forest below, trailing black smoke. Brenner watched his formation disintegrate with growing fury and disbelief. These weren't the inexperienced American pilots he'd been told to expect. They flew with discipline, covered each other perfectly, and most importantly, they weren't intimidated. He'd lost 3 aircraft, 2 definitely destroyed and 1 damaged, and had inflicted no confirmed kills on the Americans. It was unacceptable. He rolled his Focke-Wulf into a dive, picking up speed, preparing for another attack. But as he descended through 6,000 feet, his tactical situation assessment changed everything. Below, another formation of American aircraft was approaching, 12 P-51 Mustangs, drawn by the radio calls of combat. The Germans were now outnumbered almost 3-1. Brenner made the hard decision. Achtung, all aircraft, break off, return to base. His voice was tight with controlled anger. They'd been beaten, not by superior equipment or numbers, but by better tactics and courage. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The remaining German fighters disengaged, using their speed to dive away toward German lines. Schmidt, who damaged Ramirez's aircraft, found himself pursued by both Chen and O'Brien. The two American pilots worked as a team, Chen forcing the German into a turn where O'Brien could get a deflection shot. O'Brien's burst was precise, a 2-second trigger pull that sent a stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds into the Focke-Wulf's engine. The Daimler-Benz power plant exploded, and Schmidt joined Weber in a desperate parachute descent. Hartwell leveled out his Thunderbolt and took stock of the situation. All 5 American aircraft were still flying, though Ramirez's bird looked rough. Diamond flight, sound off. Status report. 2 is good. Minor damage, all systems green, Chen reported. 3, I'm operational. Ammunition down to 20%, O'Brien called. 4 here. I've got some holes, but everything's working. Murphy's voice carried equal parts relief and residual adrenaline. 5, I've taken hits to my hydraulics and fuel system. I'm losing pressure and reading fuel loss from the right wing tank. Ramirez's voice remained calm, but the situation was serious. Hartwell made a quick decision. All aircraft, reform on me. 5, tuck in close. We're heading back to base as a unit. Nobody gets left behind. The flight reformed, with Ramirez's damaged Thunderbolt surrounded by the other 4 aircraft. Fuel was streaming from damaged lines in his right wing, leaving a visible vapor trail. The hydraulic pressure gauge was dropping steadily, which meant his landing gear might not deploy properly, but he was flying, and his engine was still running strong. The return flight took 45 minutes that felt like hours. Hartwell continuously monitored Ramirez's status, while Chen and O'Brien kept watch for any German fighters that might try to finish off the damaged aircraft. Murphy, still high on adrenaline from his head-on pass, kept clearing his 6 o'clock position, his hands tight on the controls. Ramirez fought a constant battle to keep his damaged Thunderbolt flying. The fuel leak from his right wing was getting worse, the vapor trail behind him growing more visible. He'd switched to his reserve tank, but the gauge was dropping faster than it should. The hydraulic pressure was almost gone, which meant he had no brakes, possibly no landing gear. His controls felt mushy, delayed. Some of the hydraulic lines that assisted the control surfaces must have been damaged, but the engine kept running, that magnificent Pratt and Whitney radial turning over with reassuring power. The oil pressure remained good, the temperature stayed within limits. The Thunderbolt was living up to its reputation for toughness, absorbing damage that would have brought down most fighters. Ramirez talked to his aircraft, encouraging it, promising to take care of it if it just got him home. Pilots did that sometimes, developed an almost personal relationship with their machines, especially after combat. Hartwell flew close formation, close enough that Ramirez could see his flight leader's face through the canopy. Hartwell gave him a thumbs up, a simple gesture that meant everything in that moment. You're going to make it. We've got you. Stay focused. Ramirez returned the gesture, though his hand was shaking. The Belgian countryside passed below them, a winter landscape of white fields and dark forests. Smoke rose from burning vehicles, evidence of the ground battle still raging. They passed over American positions, and Ramirez could see troops looking up, waving. Those soldiers didn't know that the 5 Thunderbolts overhead had just fought and won against Germany's elite. They just saw a friendly aircraft, a reminder that they weren't alone in this frozen hell. As they crossed into France and approached their base, Hartwell's voice came through the radio, calm and professional. 5, how's your fuel state? As they approached their base near Cambrai, France, Hartwell radioed ahead. Tower, this is Diamond Lead. We have 1 bird with battle damage, hydraulics failing, possible gear problems. Request priority landing and emergency equipment standing by. Roger, Diamond Lead. You're cleared for straight-in approach. Crash crews are rolling. Ramirez went in first, with Hartwell flying formation off his wing, ready to call out any problems the damaged aircraft's pilot couldn't see. The landing gear deployed. First the left main, then the nose wheel, but the right main gear remained stubbornly retracted. 5, you've got a hung right main. It's not locked, Hartwell reported. Ramirez's voice remained steady. Roger. I'm going to try a manual extension. He pumped the emergency landing gear extension handle using muscle power to force hydraulic fluid through damaged lines. The gear indicator flickered, then showed green. The right main had locked down, but there was no way to know if it would hold weight. The Thunderbolt touched down on its left main and nose gear first. For a moment, it seemed the landing would be successful. Then, as Ramirez eased the right wing down, the damaged gear strut collapsed. The right wingtip dug into the runway in a shower of sparks. Ramirez fought the controls, keeping the aircraft from ground looping as it skidded down the runway, trailing smoke and sparks. Crash trucks raced alongside, their crews ready to respond. The Thunderbolt finally ground to a halt. Its right wing crumpled, propeller blades bent, but Ramirez was already climbing out of the cockpit, waving to indicate he was uninjured. The crash crews surrounded the aircraft, spraying foam on hot metal and checking for fire hazards. Hartwell landed his Thunderbolt and taxied quickly to where Ramirez stood beside his wrecked aircraft. As he climbed down from his cockpit, the other pilots were already gathering. They'd survived an engagement with Germany's elite, and all 5 had made it back. The intelligence officer who debriefed them was initially skeptical of their claims. 5 aircraft had engaged 8 of Germany's best pilots, shot down 4, confirmed with 1 probable, and all returned to base. It seemed too good to be true. But gun camera footage didn't lie, and the wreckage of Kramer's aircraft had been spotted by ground forces, along with parachutes from the other German pilots. What emerged from the debriefing was a picture of near-perfect tactical execution. Hartwell's immediate defensive wheel had prevented the German ambush from achieving surprise. The discipline of maintaining formation had ensured mutual support. Each pilot had covered the others, and when individual aircraft were threatened, teammates had been in position to respond. It was textbook fighter tactics, executed under combat conditions by pilots who trusted each other completely. Colonel Thomas Anderson, the group commander, listened to the debrief with growing interest. He'd flown his own share of combat missions and recognized something exceptional in what he was hearing. "Gentlemen," he said when they'd finished, "what you accomplished today wasn't luck. It was superior training, discipline, and courage. Major Brenner's unit is one of the best the Germans have. The fact that 5 of you not only survived but dominated that engagement says something important about the quality of our pilots and the value of fighting as a team." In the days that followed, the engagement was noted in intelligence reports and squadron records, but it never received the publicity of some other air battles. 5 Thunderbolts defeating 8 of Germany's elite seemed almost routine in the broader context of Allied air superiority by late 1944. The larger story of the Battle of the Bulge overshadowed individual air combats, no matter how exceptional. But within the fighter community, the story spread. Other squadrons studied the tactics Hartwell's flight had used. The defensive wheel became a standard procedure for outnumbered formations. The emphasis on mutual support and maintaining formation integrity was reinforced in training. And the example of 5 pilots, different backgrounds, different experience levels, functioning as a perfectly coordinated unit became a case study in effective fighter tactics. For the 5 pilots themselves, the engagement was a defining moment. Hartwell would go on to fly 32 more combat missions before the war ended, eventually returning to Iowa, where he became a flight instructor for the newly formed Air Force. He rarely spoke about the war, but when he did, he always emphasized the importance of trusting your wingman and fighting as a team. Back in Iowa, Hartwell found that civilian life required its own adjustments. The farm he'd grown up on seemed smaller somehow, quieter. His father had aged considerably during the war years, the hard work and worry taking their toll. James took over more of the farm work, but flying remained in his blood. When the Air Force Reserve program started, he joined immediately, and when the Korean War broke out, he volunteered to return to active duty. His wife, Martha, whom he'd married in 1946, understood. She'd grown up in a military family and knew that some men carried the war with them long after the shooting stopped. She supported his decision to return to service, though she worried every day he was gone. Hartwell flew combat missions in Korea, this time in jets, F-86 Sabres hunting MiG-15s over the Yalu River. The technology had changed, but the fundamentals remained the same: mutual support, tactical discipline, and trusting your wingman. After Korea, he retired from active duty and devoted himself to teaching the next generation of fighter pilots. He was known as a demanding instructor who emphasized the basics: formation discipline, mutual support, and tactical awareness. He told his students about that day over Belgium, about 5 Thunderbolts against 8 of Germany's best. Technology changes, he'd say. Aircraft get faster, weapons get more sophisticated, but the principles stay the same. Take care of your wingman, follow your training, and keep your head in the fight. He died in 1998 at the age of 86, surrounded by family. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, including dozens of pilots he'd trained and several of the men he'd flown with during the war. Chen, O'Brien, and Murphy were all there, old men now, but standing straight as they honored their former flight leader. Chen faced renewed discrimination when he returned to the United States after the war, but he persevered, eventually becoming one of the first Asian American pilots hired by a major commercial airline. The transition wasn't easy. He applied to multiple airlines, and most rejected him without even granting an interview. When he finally got hired by Trans World Airlines in 1951, he faced skepticism from passengers who'd never seen an Asian pilot before. Some actually refused to board aircraft he was flying, demanding a real American pilot. Chen absorbed these insults with the same quiet determination that had carried him through the war. He let his flying do the talking. He was never late, never made mistakes, and his passenger safety record was impeccable. Slowly, reluctantly, the skeptics came around. By the time he made captain in 1963, he was widely respected throughout the airline industry. Younger Asian American pilots who came after him often sought him out, asking for advice on how to handle discrimination and prejudice. He flew passenger jets for 30 years, retiring in 1981 after accumulating over 25,000 flight hours. In his retirement, he volunteered at a museum dedicated to Asian American military service, ensuring that the contributions of pilots like himself weren't forgotten. He gave talks at schools, sharing his experiences and encouraging young people to pursue their dreams regardless of the obstacles they faced. Chen wrote a memoir in 1993 titled Flying Free, An Asian American Pilot's Journey. The book became an unexpected bestseller, particularly popular among Asian American communities. He donated much of the proceeds to scholarship funds for minority students pursuing aviation careers. When he died in 2006, at the age of 83, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including several congressmen and the Chinese-American mayor of San Francisco. His legacy lived on in the dozens of pilots he'd mentored and inspired. O'Brien returned to Texas and to crop dusting, finding peace in flying low over the same fields he'd known before the war. The skills he'd learned in combat translated well to precision agricultural flying, and he built a successful business that he eventually passed on to his children. But the war never truly left him. He had nightmares occasionally, waking up in cold sweats, seeing the faces of the German pilots he'd fought against. His wife Sarah learned to comfort him through these episodes, holding him until the memories faded. He found that flying helped. There was something therapeutic about low-level work, skimming over cotton fields at dawn, the world still and quiet except for the sound of his engine. It was similar to combat flying, but without the threat of death, the adrenaline replaced by peaceful concentration. He taught his children to fly, passing on his love of aviation to the next generation. 2 of his sons became commercial pilots, and his daughter became an air traffic controller. O'Brien maintained contact with Hartwell and the others through annual reunions that continued for decades. These gatherings became more important as they got older, a chance to connect with the only people who truly understood what they'd been through. They didn't talk much about specific combat missions. That seemed ghoulish, celebrating killing. Instead, they talked about the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, and the bonds forged in the crucible of combat. He died in 2003 at the age of 83 from complications of heart disease. His funeral was held at a small church in rural Texas, the same church he'd attended as a child. His family arranged for a missing man formation flyover, 4 crop dusters flying in tight formation, 1 breaking away and climbing toward the sky. It was a fitting tribute to a man who'd lived his life in the air. Murphy, the youngest of the group, stayed in the military after the war. He flew missions in Korea and served in various staff positions before retiring as a colonel. He credited his survival in that December engagement over Belgium with teaching him lessons about courage and teamwork that shaped his entire career. In his retirement, he wrote a detailed memoir of his wartime experiences, dedicating an entire chapter to that day over the Ardennes. Ramirez returned to New Mexico, where he used the GI Bill to earn a degree in engineering. He worked on early aerospace projects and eventually became a senior engineer at a major defense contractor. He remained quiet about his wartime service, but his children discovered his medals and decorations after his death and learned for the first time about their father's extraordinary courage under fire. On the German side, Major Klaus Brenner survived the war, though he was shot down twice more before Germany's surrender. He never forgot the engagement over Belgium, where 5 American pilots in supposedly inferior aircraft had thoroughly defeated his elite unit. In his post-war memoir, he wrote candidly about that day, acknowledging that the Americans had outfought his unit through superior tactics and teamwork. He praised the unknown American leader who had executed the defensive wheel and kept his formation together under attack. Friedrich Weber, who'd bailed out after O'Brien's guns damaged his aircraft, was captured by American troops and spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp. He returned to Germany after the war and worked as a flight instructor, teaching a new generation of German pilots the importance of tactical discipline and mutual support, lessons he'd learned the hard way over Belgium. Hans Miller's damaged aircraft made it back to German-controlled territory, but his engine seized before he could reach his base. He belly-landed in a field and walked away with minor injuries. He flew 12 more combat missions before being grounded due to accumulated injuries and combat fatigue. After the war, he emigrated to Argentina, where he died in 1968, never having spoken publicly about his wartime experiences. Joseph Kramer, whose aircraft had exploded after Ramirez's burst, left a widow and 2 young children in Bavaria. His name was added to countless memorial lists of German fighter pilots killed in action, one more statistic in the massive aerial war over Europe. Ernst Schmidt, shot down by Chen and O'Brien, survived his parachute landing but was captured immediately by American forces. He provided valuable intelligence about German air tactics and unit dispositions during his interrogation. The engagement over the Ardennes on December 23, 1944, lasted less than 15 minutes from first contact to final disengagement. In that brief span, the 5 American pilots and their P-47 Thunderbolts had proven several crucial points about aerial combat. First, that technological advantages could be overcome by superior tactics and teamwork. Second, that maintaining formation discipline under pressure was worth more than individual aerobatic skill. And third, that courage and mutual trust could defeat even the most experienced opponents. The broader Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month, with tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. The Luftwaffe would make one final major effort on January 1st, 1945, Operation Bodenplatte, in which they would lose nearly 300 aircraft and many of their remaining experienced pilots in a desperate attempt to destroy Allied air power on the ground. The losses in that operation, including many pilots like those who'd fought over the Ardennes, would effectively end the Luftwaffe as a significant fighting force. But on that cold December day in 1944, 5 American pilots had written a small chapter in the larger story of Allied air superiority. They'd proven that well-trained, disciplined pilots flying as a coordinated team could defeat numerically superior forces of elite enemy fighters. They'd survived an ambush that should have scattered or destroyed their formation. And they'd brought each other home, damaged but intact. The lesson of that forgotten ambush wasn't about the superiority of one aircraft over another, or even about the bravery of individual pilots. It was about something more fundamental: the power of teamwork, mutual trust, and disciplined execution of sound tactics under the stress of combat. These weren't abstract concepts taught in training manuals. They were the difference between survival and death, between victory and defeat, between coming home and becoming another statistic in the vast machinery of war. In the decades after the war, as aviation technology advanced beyond recognition and jet aircraft replaced the piston-engine fighters of World War II, the fundamental principles demonstrated by Hartwell's flight remained relevant. Fighter pilots still trained in mutual support tactics. Formation discipline was still emphasized. And the importance of teamwork over individual heroics remained a core tenet of fighter doctrine. The 5 Thunderbolts and their pilots became a case study at service academies and in fighter weapons schools. The engagement was analyzed from every angle: the initial German advantage of surprise and altitude, Hartwell's immediate defensive response, the execution of the defensive wheel, the individual engagements within the larger battle, and the successful recovery of all 5 aircraft despite damage. Each element offered lessons that could be applied to modern air combat, even as the aircraft and weapons changed. For those who study military history, the engagement stands as a reminder that wars are not won solely by technological superiority or numerical advantage. They are won by well-trained professionals who understand their mission, trust their teammates, and execute their tactics with discipline and skill. The 5 pilots who flew Thunderbolts over Belgium that December day exemplified these qualities. They were not superhuman. They made mistakes, felt fear, and struggled with the same challenges as any combat pilot. But when the moment came, they performed flawlessly as a team, and that made all the difference. The story of the forgotten ambush over the Ardennes deserves to be remembered, not because it changed the course of the war, it didn't, but because it demonstrates timeless principles about courage, competence, and the power of individuals working together toward a common goal. In an age of precision weapons and stealth technology, when individual pilots might go their entire careers without facing enemy aircraft in combat, the lessons from that brief engagement remain as relevant as ever. Somewhere in the archives of the United States Air Force, the gun camera footage still exists, showing tracers arcing through winter sky, aircraft maneuvering violently, and the brief flashes of hits on target. The after-action reports sit in filing cabinets, their pages yellowed with age, and in the memories of the families of those 5 pilots, stories are still told about the day their fathers and grandfathers faced Germany's elite and emerged victorious. The frozen forests of Belgium have long since recovered from the scars of war. The fields where aircraft crashed have been plowed and replanted countless times. The sky where that brief, violent engagement took place looks no different than it did before or since. But for those who know where to look, the story remains, written in old records and fading memories, the story of 5 Thunderbolts and the forgotten ambush where they proved that skill, courage, and teamwork can overcome any odds.